Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled you're here with us because today we are unpacking a really fascinating, honestly, kind of paradoxical piece of history. We're looking at two ancient aristocrats who did something that is just almost unheard of. They held massive, unchecked power, and instead of holding on to it for dear life, they literally gave it away. They deliberately relocated sovereignty from themselves into a system of laws. Yep, we're talking about Solon of Athens and Publicola of Rome.
Okay, let's just dive right in with a question that feels, well, honestly, just as relevant today as it did a couple of millennia ago. How exactly do you fix a broken city when you already hold all the cards, when you have all the power? Usually history gives us these fiery reformers who smash the system from the outside. But Solon and Publicola, they were a totally different breed. They were wealthy, prominent insiders, the elite of the elite, and they reformed their societies not by burning it all down, but by working from the inside out and persuading their peers.
To really get our heads around why they stepped up, we need to look at just how close these cities were to absolute disaster.
Let's set the stage a bit. We've got Athens in 594 BC and Rome in 509 BC. Two very different crises, but both cities are practically teetering on the brink of total revolution. Over in Athens, it's utter economic collapse. The poor are being absolutely crushed by debt. I mean, to the point where folks were literally putting their own bodies up as collateral. If they couldn't pay, they were sold into slavery. Crazy, right? The land was all mortgaged to just a handful of super rich families. Meanwhile, Rome is completely fracturing, but for a totally different reason. Pure moral outrage. Their king, Tarquin the Proud, had just become entirely intolerable, and the absolute breaking point was the tragic assault and subsequent suicide of the noblewoman Lucretia. So you have two desperate cities, and people on both sides of the divide are just scrambling for any kind of solution.
And this brings us to what I think is the real moral centerpiece of both these stories, the flat-out refusal of absolute power.
When the heat was turned up the highest, both of these guys were basically handed the ultimate prize on a silver platter. Solon was appointed chief magistrate of Athens with emergency sweeping powers. And here's the wild part. The poor wanted him to just take all the land and redistribute it, while the rich wanted him to protect their wealth. Actually, both sides were practically begging him to just declare himself a tyrant and force his will on everyone. But he said no. He flatly refused, and he dropped this absolutely incredible quote. "A tyranny is a very fair spot, but it has no way down from it." He saw the trap right away. Once you grab absolute power, you can never ever safely let it go. Over in Rome, Publicola faced a very similar temptation, and his response was, well, it was legendary. After they kicked the Roman king out, Publicola was elected as one of the very first consuls. But he happened to be building this massive, gorgeous mansion up on a hill overlooking the center of the city. Naturally, rumors start spreading like wildfire that he wants to be the new king. So what's his PR strategy? He doesn't make a speech. He literally orders his own dream house to be completely demolished, overnight. Just leveled. Talk about a dramatic way to squash a rumor, right? It was this undeniable physical proof that he bowed to the Republic.
So, if you're firmly deciding not to be a king or a tyrant, what's the next step? You have to start building the legal scaffolding.
You have to design a system that's going to outlive you. In Athens, Solon's biggest, boldest move was the seisakteia, which beautifully translates to the shaking off of burdens. He wiped the slate clean, canceled all debts, abolished debt bondage entirely. A total game changer. But oh man, it came with a massive scandal. Get this, Solon secretly told a few close friends about his plan before making it public. And those friends? They used that insider knowledge to borrow a ton of money and buy up cheap land, knowing full well the debts would vanish the next day. This ancient insider trading scandal nearly ruined Solon, but he gritted his teeth and pushed the reforms through anyway.
After he stopped the economic bleeding, Solon completely reorganized society into 4 property classes. Now, civic rights were tied to income, which, yeah, it doesn't sound super fair to us today, but here is the crucial takeaway. Even the very lowest, entirely propertyless class, the Thetes, were given a seat at the table. For the first time ever, they got a vote in the assembly and the right to serve on juries. It wasn't full-blown democracy just yet, but Solon planted this radical seed that an ordinary citizen actually mattered in the grand machinery of the state.
Now, jumping back to Rome, how did they build their scaffolding? Well, the Romans had just sworn a literal blood oath to never ever have a king again. So they created the office of the consul, and the setup here is just brilliant. Instead of one guy ruling for life, you have 2 executives. They only get to serve for a single year, and here is the kicker. They can completely veto each other. By splitting the power in half and putting a strict timer on it, they structurally deleted the concept of a king.
And Publicola took it even a step further. He's the guy credited with establishing something called provocatio, Basically, this was the right of any Roman citizen to appeal a death sentence handed down by a consul directly to the assembly of the people. This one single law physically yanked the ultimate power of life and death right out of the executive's hands and handed it to the citizens. It became the absolute bedrock of Roman liberty. So you step back and it's like a giant puzzle coming together perfectly. Both of these leaders built these incredibly robust, interlocking systems. You've got courts of appeal, you've got annual magistracies so nobody gets too comfortable, legislative councils to draft the laws, and, this is key, separating the money from the executive branch. Rome did this by creating quaestors to handle the treasury. All these moving parts locked in to create a machine where the system itself mattered way more than the person sitting in the chair.
But here's the hardest part. Building the machine is one thing. Having the sheer discipline to actually walk away from it, that is something else entirely. You really have to prove that the office is not the man. 10. That is the number of years Solon demanded to be away from Athens after his laws went into effect. He literally packed his bags and went traveling abroad for a full decade. Why? Because he knew if he stayed, the Athenians would constantly pester him to tweak or reinterpret his own laws. He essentially fired himself. He forced them to live with the system he built without him hovering around playing supreme judge.
Now, over in Rome, the ultimate proof that the law was supreme was, well, it was much darker, but frankly awe-inspiring. Publicola's co-founder of the Republic was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. When a plot was uncovered to bring that exiled King Tarquin back, Brutus found out that his own sons were part of the treason. And as consul, Brutus didn't blink. He ordered the execution of his own sons. He put the survival of this fragile new republic above his own flesh and blood. It sent a terrifying, crystal-clear signal. Under this new system, absolutely no one is above the law.
And that brings us to the profound legacy of liberty these men left behind, the absolute birth of the Republic.
These weren't just quick fixes for a temporary crisis. They literally echoed through history. They laid down the very DNA of republicanism that we still rely on right now. The Roman historian Livy summed it up perfectly when he wrote, "The consular authority was made annual, and the origin of liberty you may date from this period." I mean, just pause and think about the weight of that. The whole concept of civic liberty, of being a free citizen and not a subject, dates back to this specific shift, to the exact moment power was put on a timer and made to bow to the law. Looking at how their stories end tells us exactly who these guys were at their core. On one hand, you have Solon slipping quietly away into a decade of exile, just watching his city learn how to stand on its own 2 feet. And on the other, Publicola passes away, and Plutarch writes that the whole city mourned him, not as a ruler, but as a common father. These were elites who could have so easily circled the wagons and hoarded their power when things got tough, but instead, they threw the doors wide open. They gave the power away.
Which leaves us with a pretty vital question to chew on. We've seen how Solon and Publicola laid the bedrock for the legal and civic structures we completely take for granted today simply by refusing power. So you have to ask yourself, if absolute, unchecked power was handed to today's leaders during a massive crisis, would they really have the discipline to walk away? Think about that for a second. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.